So the question is this really informing us about the welfare? You know, is it the case that, you know, wild animals, if they had the chance, would love to sleep more? We don't know. So, you know, often, you know, we'll see in captivity, animals express relatively little vigilance behaviour because they have no fear of predators. Is that a bad thing that the animal's living without fear? So, you know, these are the kind of questions that we have when we try and use these kind of behavioural comparisons. Next slide. Okay, somebody asked me earlier about play behaviour. You know, people for a very long time have tried to use play behaviour as a measure of animal welfare. Some people have argued that animals only play when they have good welfare. I don't think that there's conclusive evidence that's true for all species. So, and I would say that it's not a universal thing that we can say that animals which are playing are animals which have good welfare. And we know, for example, the bigger brain you have, so the bigger brain a species has, the more they play, anyway. So humans play a lot because they've got very large brains. Chimps play a lot because they've got very large brains. If you look at the primate family in a comparative way, the smaller the brain, the less they play. So, you know, we need to be careful about some of these ideas. Next slide. So one of the other big behavioural measures that's been used, and particularly is of concern to zoos, is abnormal behaviour. So abnormal behaviour has been around, of course, ever since animals have been in captivity. It's nothing new, it's not something of recent times. There are studies showing that animals 3,000 years ago in captivity were expressing abnormal behaviour. So it's not a modern consequence of a zoo environment. However, what we know now is the zoo visitors are much more educated about this and they don't like to see it. It creates a very negative impression of zoo if animals are expressing abnormal behaviours, like the one we can see here with this this capuchin biting the bars of its enclosure. Next slide. So, just to clarify one point, not all abnormal behaviours are stereotypies. Stereotypies are one type of abnormal behaviour. Okay, people often say stereotypy for everything. Stereotypy is just one type of abnormal behaviour. It's the most commonly one studied because it's the most obvious one. Okay, next slide. So we have two types of abnormal behaviour. We have qualitative abnormal behaviour and we have quantitative abnormal behaviour. Next slide. Awesome. So qualitative abnormal behaviour is behaviour that the animal expresses in captivity, but we never see the animal expressing it in the wild. Okay, so this is what we call a qualitative abnormal behaviour. So the pacing up and down we see by large carnivores sometimes would be an example. We don't see polar bears pacing up and down in the Arctic. Okay, so this is why it's a qualitatively abnormal behaviour. Next slide. And there are a whole range of them, from stereotypies to body postures, masturbation, eating feces, floating arm. Do you know what floating arm is? It's more commonly seen in laboratory primates. It's where you'll see a primate in a small cage and he'll sit and suddenly his arm develops a life of its own like this. And then often you'll see the primate look shocked and it will look at its arm and pull it down. So, you know, there's a whole host like that, sometimes infanticide, self-mutilation, but also we'll see all these behaviours in certain species in the wild as well. So Japanese macaques, middle-ranking Japanese macaques in the wild, bite themselves on their arms, and they bite themselves and they actually perforate their arms. So you might think something like automutilation, yeah, would be something only in captivity, but yet we still see it in certain wild species. Next slide. So what this all means, yeah, is that the definition of qualitatively abnormal behaviour is species-specific. You can't say that infanticide, you can't say self-mutilation is always an abnormal behaviour, always qualitatively abnormal behaviour, because there might be species in the wild that do this as part of their normal behavioural repertoire. They will probably do it when they're stressed in the wild, but it's still part of their repertoire. Next slide, please. So then we have quantitatively abnormal behaviour, which is behaviour expressed at a higher frequency or duration than we would normally see in the wild. So animals might be more sleepy, They might be more aggressive, they might be much less social than they would be in the wild. Okay, so this is an example of quantitatively abnormal behaviour. Next slide. So, and again, I've kind of indicated that these things can be problematic because the amount of time you spend doing a behaviour is dependent on the resources in your environment. So if you have a lot of resources, you might do a behaviour for a very little period of time. If you have very few of that type of resource, such as food, then you might forage for a very long period of time. And also that might induce aggression and things like that. Next slide, please. So, just to go a little bit on stereotypies, so this is one of the most commonly looked at behaviour, and its definition is the same behaviour repeated over and over in a sequence. Yeah? The behaviour has the same physical and temporal structure, so it's always the same physically and in time, and it has no apparent function. So these are the ones that are very obvious to the public. So, an animal that rubs itself all day long, or a giraffe that spends licking the same spot for hours and hours. Very obvious to people that there's something going wrong here in terms of the animal's welfare. Next slide, please. So, here are some examples. Two basic types, locomotor and oral stereotypies. So pacing, somersaulting, these kind of things are locomotor stereotypies. Licking things and playing with their tongues, so a number of animals like giraffes will play with their tongues for hours on end, are examples of oral stereotypies. Next slide, please. And so why do animals stereotype? Why do we get these abnormal behaviours? Well, we know that the most prevalent in barren environments, environments without stimuli, and environments where the animals, we could say, are bored, would they sometimes generate out of fear, or frustration, or stress, and sometimes they're a result of brain damage or behavioural developmental problems. Okay, so there are a number of reasons, but pretty much always they indicate a problem or the animal's recently in a problematic environment. This is one of the issues. You can get an animal from a poor environment, put it into a wonderful enriched environment, and it will carry on performing abnormal behaviour because of its history. And this has been quite an issue for many zoos around the world, is they've received animals which have got very bad abnormal behaviour, and they get blamed for it, when in fact it was the previous zoo environment that caused it, not them. Sometimes it's very hard to eradicate these behaviours. Next slide. So, why do animals do these things? Stereotypies is a mechanism to cope with an inadequate environment. That's one of the theories. There is some evidence to support that. So when animals are stereotyping, they self-narcotize. So a very interesting study done by Björn Wexler at the Zurich Zoo. He had pacing polar bears, and he would throw a bucket of water in their faces, and they would just completely ignore it as if nothing had happened. And he would do this repeatedly, and so it was like they'd remove themselves consciously from their environment through this kind of self-narcotizing process. Another idea is that the behavioural systems, the systems which control behaviour through feedback, are out of control because there isn't the feedback. Animals want to express their repetitive behaviour, which they can do, but there's no feedback to switch that repetitive behaviour off because they don't control their environment. So their behavioural systems have kind of gone out of control. Okay, next slide please. And we know that certain species are more prone to abnormal behaviour than other species. So for example, in carnivores in the wild, which have very large home ranges, so polar bears for example, are much more prone to this kind of behaviour than carnivores which have small home ranges. So for example, American mink. This is a study done by Georgia Mason. Next slide please. Okay, so, abnormal behaviour, the public don't like to see. The zoos don't like to see because the public obviously complain about it. It tells that there's a welfare problem. It's not always easy to use because for a lot of species we don't know enough about their wild behaviour to really make a decision how abnormal something is. And sometimes, abnormal behaviour can be an indication of a health problem. So Chester Zoo had a spectacled bear that was pacing up and down, and everybody's, oh, we need enrichment, oh yeah, we need to solve this problem, yeah? Do you know what the problem was? Toothache. As soon as they treated the bad tooth, the bear stopped pacing. Think about it yourself. If you've got toothache, I know what I do. If I'm waiting in the dentist, I'm like body rocking incessantly, yeah? So, so we have to look at, sometimes there can be physical basis to some of these problems. Not always assume that it's just the environment. There can be a health basis. Next slide, please. So, there's a whole range of other ways we can look at the well-being of animals. So from stress tests, such as open field, but these are tests which are really much more appropriate to use in a laboratory environment than in a zoo environment. So looking at animals in a new environment, how much they move around. The idea being that animals which are less stressed or fearful will move around more in a new environment than animals which are more stressed and more fearful. Next slide, please. And of course we move over to all the physiological measures, so heart rate, blood pressure, heart rate variability, stress hormones, and so on and so forth. Okay, these have been used for a long time, and they've been largely correlated with behavioural measures over time. So they're one's kind of supporting the other. People have also looked at things like immune competence and things like that as kind of physiological measures of well-being. Next slide, please. So, the theory is, as you can see here, animals which have low levels of stress hormones, heart rate within normal limits, normal blood pressure, and no other, signs of failing biological systems, so failing reproduction, some people would argue that their well-being is good. I wouldn't necessarily argue because I think there are all these other components in there, such as their mental well-being and stuff like that as well. Next slide, please. And the problem is, again, with these measures, individual variation. Yeah? So you can guess which one I would be on this roller coaster. Yeah? I would hate it. Yeah? Again, we go back to the situation. Yeah? The physiological response here and the physiological response here is the same. So if we're measuring their stress hormones, we're measuring their heart rate, we're measuring their blood pressure, it's the same. Okay? So it's very difficult for us to actually do something using those kind of indicators. Please don't do it. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So, some people have argued we can try and improve welfare by giving animals choice.